A packed cafe in Memphis, no empty seats. A woman stopped at a stranger's table, a black man sitting alone waiting for his daughter. She hesitated, then raised her hands and signed, "I'm sorry, I'm alone. Can I sit here?" She expected confusion, maybe an awkward smile and a slow headshake. Instead, he signed back calm, fluent, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And in that moment, everything changed. Before we get into the story, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. It's always something to see how far these stories travel. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. New stories go up every week, and they're always the kind worth sitting down for. Now, let's get into it. Moises Carter had a rule about Saturday mornings. No work calls, no emails, no thinking about the job site on Beale Street that was already 3 days behind schedule. Saturday mornings were his and this cafe and the small round table near the window that he had quietly claimed as his own without ever asking anyone's permission. He didn't know exactly when it had become a ritual. Somewhere in the years after he lost his wife, he had built a new shape for his weekends, one that didn't require talking about what was missing, only acknowledging what was still here. A cup of dark roast, the same window, the same chair angled slightly toward the street so he could watch the neighborhood move past without feeling like he was hiding from it. Every Saturday without fail. It was the kind of routine that didn't look like much from the outside, but for a man who had spent the better part of 6 years learning how to keep things from falling apart, it was everything. His wife, Renee, had died of complications from a surgery that should have been straightforward. That was the part that had taken the longest to make sense of, not the loss itself, which was enormous, but the ordinariness of how it happened. No warning, no long goodbye. Just a Tuesday that started like any other and ended in a way that rearranged everything that came after. He had been 40 when she died, and for a long time after 40 felt less like an age and more like a line drawn in the middle of his life before and after. 6 years later, the line was still there. He didn't expect it to disappear. What had changed was that he had built a life on the afterside of it, a good one, in the ways that mattered. He had his work, which he was good at, and which gave him something solid to stand on. He had Randy and the community he'd found through him. He had this cafe, this table, this chair angled toward the window. He was sitting with his first cup and his phone face down on the table. The phone being face down was part of the rule when the woman appeared at the edge of his table. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, dressed simply dark jeans, a light jacket, the kind of clothes that said she hadn't planned to be anywhere important today. She was holding a coffee cup with both hands, and her eyes were moving across the room with the careful, slightly uncomfortable look of someone who had just realized there was nowhere left to sit. The cafe was full. It got like this. On Saturdays, the whole neighborhood seemed to pour through those doors between 9 and 11 in the morning, and by the time most people arrived, every chair was taken. Moises had seen it happen to strangers dozens of times. They would stand near the door, look around, and then either leave or resign themselves to waiting. This woman didn't leave. She made her way through the room slowly, checking each table, and eventually she stopped in front of his. She looked at the empty chair across from him. Then she looked at him. For a moment, she didn't do anything. He could see her working something out, deciding whether to speak or walk away or try somewhere else. There was a particular kind of calculation in her expression that he couldn't immediately read. And then she set her coffee down carefully on the edge of the table, raised her hands, and signed. "I'm sorry. I'm alone. The cafe is full. Can I join you?" Her signing was clean and practiced, not the hesitant finger-spelled approximation of someone who had looked up a phrase on their phone that morning. She knew what she was doing, and the expression on her face as she waited for his response was one he recognized, the specific, braced look of someone who had asked this question in this language enough times to know that most people would stare back at her without understanding a single word. Moises put down his coffee cup. He signed back without thinking about it, the way you do something you've done long enough that it stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like just a part of how you move through the world. Of course. Please sit. She didn't move right away. She was looking at his hands, then at his face with an expression that was shifting in real time, the guardedness, dissolving into something that took him a second to identify. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of saying a word in a foreign country and having someone answer you back in the same language. The particular surprise of being understood somewhere you hadn't expected it. She signed again, and this time there was a different quality to it. Quicker, less careful, more like a reflex than a performance. You actually sign for a few years now, he signed back. She absorbed that for a moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Her name, she told him, was Maya Thompson. She'd moved to Memphis about 2 months ago for work. She was an interior designer, and a firm downtown had brought her on for a renovation project that was larger than anything she'd taken on before. She was still figuring out the city, still finding the places worth going back to. She said the last part with a small gesture toward the cafe around them, as if to say this might be one of them. Moises looked around the room with her at the regulars, who clearly knew each other, at the barista, who called a woman named Ruth by name, when she walked in, at the general texture of a place that had accumulated years of small familiarity, and understood exactly what she meant. You don't find a place like this by looking for it. You find it by accident on an ordinary morning when something makes you stay longer than you planned. That was more or less how it had happened for him, too. He told her he was a structural engineer, that he'd been coming to this cafe for years, always on Saturdays, always at this table, that the routine had started as something to hold on to after a hard stretch and had gradually become something he came to simply because he wanted to. She listened the way people listen when they're genuinely interested and not just waiting for their turn to speak, watching his hands nodding at the right moments, occasionally signing a short response that told him she was following not just the words, but the shape of what he was saying. He noticed that about her early, the quality of her attention, the way she didn't let anything drift past without landing. And somewhere in the middle of that first conversation, he registered something he hadn't let himself think about too directly while it was happening, the way she had first raised her hands to sign at him. She hadn't done it to test him. She hadn't done it as a last resort, or with embarrassment, or with the apologetic over-explanation he'd seen so many hearing people layer on top of their attempts. She had done it simply because it was how she spoke, and she had carried in her posture the complete preparedness to be misunderstood, that he thought was not a small thing to carry. He didn't say any of that. He picked up his coffee and let the conversation find its own pace, and outside the window the Memphis morning went on exactly as it always did. But something at the table had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in any way he could have pointed to and named. Just the quiet, specific feeling of a door that had been closed for a long time, standing very slightly open. Without the early morning noise of the cafe crowd to fill the space between them, the conversation settled into something quieter and more deliberate. Maya wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out the window for a moment. Down on the sidewalk, a man walked past with a dog that was extremely interested in a trash can. An ordinary Saturday morning going about its business. "I moved here 2 months ago," she signed eventually, "and I still haven't found a place that feels like somewhere I'd go back to." Not really. She glanced around the cafe at the regulars, who clearly knew each other, at the easy rhythm of a room that had accumulated years of small familiarity, and the look on her face was one Moises recognized. It was the look of someone standing slightly outside, the warmth not sure how to step in. "I keep walking into rooms full of people," she signed, "and still feeling like I'm on the other side of the glass." Moises understood that. Not theoretically in his bones, the way you understand something you've lived through yourself. When his wife died, the world had kept moving. People kept talking and laughing and filling up rooms, and he had stood inside those rooms feeling like he was watching it all from a very great distance. It had taken years for that feeling to fully recede. And even now, on the wrong kind of day, it could come back without warning. "That feeling goes away," he signed. slowly, but it goes. Maya looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, a question forming, or maybe the decision to answer one. My husband died 3 years ago, she signed. Car accident. She said it the way people say things they've said many times, not without weight, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has learned to carry a weight without being knocked over by it every single time. He was hearing, she continued, but he learned a sign. Not well. He made up signs sometimes when he forgot the real ones, just so he wouldn't have to stop mid-sentence. It drove me crazy. She signed the last part with a small, precise movement that managed to contain both the frustration and the tenderness of the memory at the same time. But he kept trying. Every time. Moises set his cup down. He understood now what the loneliness behind her original question had actually been about. It wasn't just the cafe, and it wasn't just being new to Memphis. It was the specific kind of alone that comes from losing the person who had built a bridge to your world and carried it with them when they left. The person who had made the effort every day without being asked twice. I started learning ASL a few years after my wife passed, he signed. A colleague at work was deaf. We'd been getting by with notes and lip reading, which wasn't really getting by at all. So I took a class at the community center, then another one. He looked down at his hands for a moment. I think I kept going because I needed something to do with my hands, something that felt like it was building towards something instead of just filling time. He hadn't said that last part to many people. It came out the way honest things sometimes do, not from a decision, but from one person telling a true thing and the air becoming the kind of air where true things are easier to say. Maya's expression didn't perform sympathy. She just held his words for a moment the way you hold something you know is real. So we're both still figuring it out, she signed. Something like that, he signed back. Outside, a small cluster of pigeons had materialized on the sidewalk near the entrance, conducting their usual territorial negotiations over a dropped piece of croissant. Neither Moises nor Maya remarked on this. The cafe hummed around them. The conversation moved after that, not away from what had just been shared, but around it the way two people sometimes will after saying something that doesn't need to be discussed further, only acknowledged. They talked about the renovation project she was working on downtown. He mentioned the job site on Beale Street and the contractor who kept rescheduling deliveries. Small things, ordinary things, but said differently than small ordinary things usually are, with the slight openness that comes from having already said something harder. At one point, she asked him what drew him to structural engineering, and he found himself giving her a more honest answer than he usually gave to that question, something about the satisfaction of understanding what holds things up, what makes a structure sound, what the difference is between something that looks stable and something that actually is. She'd listened to that and then signed, "That's not really about buildings, is it?" He'd looked at her. Not entirely. He was also aware of what neither of them was saying. There was an obvious thing in the air between them, the kind of obvious thing that two careful people can notice simultaneously, while both choosing for now to look slightly to the left of it. Moises had not let himself want anything from another person in a long time. Not because he had decided against it, but because wanting something meant being willing to lose it, and he was not sure he had rebuilt enough of himself to absorb another loss. He suspected Maya was doing her own version of the same calculation. The way she engaged warmly, but with a certain self-possession fully present, but not leaning in, suggested someone who had learned the hard way to be deliberate about what she let herself move toward. Neither of them said any of this. They didn't need to. They talked until the morning had given way to late morning, and the cafe had begun to thin out slightly. At some point, Moises realized he'd been at the table for almost 2 hours longer than any Saturday in recent memory. When the morning finally wound down and he started gathering his things, he reached into his jacket pocket and found a pen. He pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser on the table, wrote his number on it, and slid it across to Maya without making it into anything more than what it was. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Her hands came up slowly like she was working out whether to say the thing she was about to say. I almost didn't ask. To sit, I mean. She signed it quietly. I almost just left. Moises looked at her at the steadiness she wore like a second skin, and underneath it the thing it was covering. The same thing he recognized in himself on the mornings he almost didn't come to the cafe, almost called the whole ritual off, almost let the grief win the small daily argument it kept picking with him. He signed back simply, "But you didn't." Maya looked down at the napkin. She picked it up and folded it once carefully and slid it into the pocket of her jacket. Then she signed a brief goodbye, measured, unhurried, and stood up from the table. Moises watched her make her way through the cafe toward the door. She moved with the quiet self-containment of someone who had learned to take up exactly the right amount of space, no more, no less. At the door, she didn't look back. He hadn't expected her to. That wasn't. He was beginning to understand the kind of person she was. He sat for another few minutes at the empty table, finishing the last of his coffee. Outside, the Memphis morning was still going unhurried, ordinary, entirely indifferent to the fact that something small but significant had just taken place at a table near the window. He thought about the way she'd signed that last thing. I almost just left. And the strange, quiet weight of knowing that if she had looked at the full cafe and decided it wasn't worth the effort, hadn't raised her hands, had simply turned around and walked out the door, none of the last 2 hours would have existed at all. That night, Moises sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd stopped drinking 20 minutes ago. The house was quiet, in the way it always got after dark. The particular stillness of a place that belonged to one person, and felt in certain hours like it was gently reminding him of that. He was used to this quiet. He had made his peace with it more or less the way you make your peace with the things you can't change, not by forgetting them, but by learning to be in the same room with them without flinching. Tonight, though, the quiet felt different. Not heavier, just more noticeable. He had given a stranger his phone number on a napkin. He turned that over in his mind the way you turn over something you've done before you fully understood you were doing it. Not with regret, but with the specific awareness of someone who had just acted on instinct and was now catching up to what the instinct had been. He thought about the way she'd held the folded napkin before putting it in her pocket. The careful, deliberate quality of it, like she was making a small decision about what to do with something fragile. He thought about what she'd signed right before that. I almost just left. The plainness of it. No performance, no invitation to feel sorry for her, just a fact offered without decoration the way she seemed to offer most things. He had told her that learning ASL had given him something to do with his hands. He hadn't framed it that way to many people. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd told her, except that she had said a true thing, and the air had become the kind of air where true things are easier to say, and the words had come out before he'd thought to stop them. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and left it on the counter. He hadn't let himself want something new in a long time. Not because he had decided against it, but because wanting something meant being willing to lose it, and for years the math on that hadn't worked out in his favor. He thought about that now, standing in the kitchen in the dark, and noticed with some surprise that the math felt slightly different tonight. Not resolved, not settled, just different in a way he couldn't entirely explain and didn't feel the need to. He went to bed. He slept eventually. 3 days later, his phone buzzed on the desk at the job site. He was in the middle of reviewing revised load calculations for the Beale Street project, and he almost didn't look. But something made him pick up the phone, some instinct operating below the level of thought. The message was a photograph. A small chalkboard sign propped outside what looked like a used bookstore, handwritten in uneven capital letters, "Quiet corner available. All are welcome." Below the photo, a text, "Found my first quiet corner in this city." He looked at it for a long moment. Something about it, the simplicity of it, The fact that she'd thought to send it to him rather than just noting it for herself settled somewhere in his chest, in a way he didn't immediately try to analyze. He typed back, "Sounds like you're building your own Memphis." Her reply came after a few minutes, "Or Memphis is building me. Jury's still out." He set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the load calculations. But the thing that had settled in his chest stayed there for the rest of the afternoon, quiet and specific, like a note played once in an empty room that keeps resonating long after the sound has stopped. They didn't text every day. It wasn't that kind of rhythm, and he suspected that suited both of them. What they did was send things when they thought of each other, which turned out to happen more often than Moises had expected. A photograph she took of a wrought iron gate on a side street she thought was interesting. A message from him about a building downtown whose original architecture from the 1920s had been uncovered during a renovation intact under 40 years of drywall. Small things. Ordinary things. But ones that required knowing something about the other person in order to know they'd want to see it. There was one evening when she sent him a photo of a room she'd been working on mid-renovation scaffolding, still up plaster dust on the floors, with the message, "This is the part nobody photographs. Before it's finished. I think it's actually the best part." He'd looked at the photo for a moment, and then at the bare bones of what would eventually become something else entirely, and typed back, "Structural engineers feel that way about a lot of things." She replied, "I figured you might." That exchange, for reasons he didn't try to fully articulate, stayed with him. 2 weeks after the Saturday at the cafe, Moises texted Maya to ask if she'd want to come to the gathering. He had her number by then. She'd been the one to reach out first, and they'd been back and forth enough that the invitation felt natural rather than significant. Still, he kept the message simple. He told her it was an informal thing, a monthly dinner at his friend Randy's house, where the loose community of deaf and hard-of-hearing people that Moises had been part of for years would come together, eat too much food, and spend a few hours in a room that operated entirely on different terms from the rest of the world. About 15 people, usually. No particular agenda. Just the specific ease of a space where no one had to negotiate the terms of being understood. He told her there was no pressure. She could come or not. She replied within the hour, "I'd like that." Randy's house was warm and loud in the way that rooms full of people signing always were, a visual kind of loud, full of movement and expression and the particular energy of a group of people who are fully unreservedly themselves. Someone had brought a dish that sparked a 20-minute debate about the correct amount of seasoning. Two people near the window were having an argument that was clearly both serious and good-humored at the same time. An older woman named Evelyn, who had been deaf from birth and had approximately no patience for anything she found uninteresting, was holding court near the bookshelf and making everyone around her laugh with a story that seemed to involve a very bad contractor and an even worse renovation outcome. Maya walked in and stood for just a moment in the doorway, taking it in. Moises watched her from across the room. He saw the instant she shifted the slight recalibration of her posture, the way the particular guardedness she wore in most rooms began quietly to come down. Because in this room there was nothing to guard against. No one was going to look at her with that specific mix of discomfort and overcorrection that hearing people sometimes couldn't help. No one was going to slow down or simplify or look faintly proud of themselves for making the effort. Everyone in this room was simply going to talk to her the way they talked to anyone else, because this was how they all talked. Randy came over, immediately introduced himself with the warmth of someone who welcomed people into his home, the way other people breathed naturally without thinking about it. Within 10 minutes, Maya was in a conversation near the kitchen with Randy and a woman named Diane about a renovation project that Diane had been trying to get a contractor to commit to for 4 months, and she was leaning into the conversation with the ease of someone who had completely forgotten to be careful. Moises stayed where he was and watched. He had seen Maya at the cafe where she was warm but self-contained. He had seen her in their text exchanges where she was thoughtful and a little dry in a way he'd come to look forward to. He had not yet seen her like this in a room where she didn't have to manage anything, where being herself required no translation or adjustment or patient waiting for understanding to arrive. She was laughing at something Diane had signed, a full laugh caught off guard by it. Her hands were moving quickly, freely, with none of the careful presentation he'd noticed in their first conversations. She looked younger. She looked, and he registered this simply, without making it into anything larger than it was at home. At some point during the evening, Evelyn made her way across the room to where Maya was standing. Evelyn, who was not known for welcoming newcomers with particular warmth until she'd decided they were worth it, looked Maya over once, the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who had been reading people for a very long time, and then launched directly into a conversation about the renovation story she'd been telling all evening, as if Maya had been there from the beginning and didn't need catching up. Maya followed without missing a beat. 15 minutes later, Evelyn said something to Randy in an aside that Moises couldn't catch from across the room. Randy glanced at Maya, then at Moises, then back at Randy with an expression that managed to say several things at once without saying any of them out loud. He came over to where Moises was standing and signed quietly, "Evelyn likes her." Moises looked at him. Randy signed, "I know you know what that means." Moises did know. Evelyn's approval was not a small thing. She had once made a man leave a gathering inside of 20 minutes for reasons that were never fully explained, but were, according to everyone present, completely justified. He looked back across the room at Maya, still deep in conversation, hands moving easily, entirely at ease, in a way he hadn't seen her be anywhere else, and something that had been sitting carefully in his chest for weeks settled just slightly into a different position. Later, as the evening wound down and people were pulling on coats and exchanging goodbyes, Maya made her way back to where Moises was standing near the door. The room was still animated around them. These gatherings never ended quickly, but there was a quieter quality to the moment between them, the way there sometimes is when two people have spent an evening in the same room and now find themselves standing apart from the noise of it. "Thank you for inviting me," she signed. Her expression was open in a way it hadn't been the first Saturday, less braced, less prepared for the possibility of being misunderstood. "Randy will invite you back himself next month," Moises signed. "Whether I'm involved or not, that's just how he operates." She smiled at that. "I'd come back either way." She said it simply without making it into anything other than what it was. He understood by now that this was how she said most things, plainly, without extra weight, trusting the words to carry what they needed to carry on their own. "Good," he signed. They stood there for a moment longer, neither in a hurry to end the evening. Outside, the Memphis night was cool and clear. Through the window, the street was quiet. Maya came back to the cafe the following Saturday. She was already there when Moises arrived at a table near the window, not his, because she didn't know yet which one was his. She had a coffee and a book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She was watching the room with the expression of someone who was for the first time watching it as a place they might belong to, rather than a place they were passing through. He crossed the room, and when she looked up and saw him, she closed the book. No performance in it, just the natural thing you do when the person you were actually waiting for walks through the door. They took his usual table, and the morning arranged itself around them the way mornings do when they've stopped being uncertain. It happened again the following Saturday, and the week after that. No one formally proposed it. There was no conversation about what it was or what it meant. The week simply accumulated Saturdays first, then occasional evenings, then the monthly gathering at Randy's house, where Evelyn had by now made it clear that she considered Maya a permanent fixture and would not be entertaining any alternative arrangements. Moises noticed the ways things changed slowly and without announcement. He started arriving at the cafe a few minutes later on Saturdays, not because he'd stopped being punctual, but because he no longer needed to be the first one there to hold the table for himself. Maya was usually already there. She had found her own seat in the rhythm of it, the way you find a seat in any room you've decided to stay in. He noticed that she had started leaving a book at his apartment between visits, not intentionally, at first he thought, and then after the third time, probably intentionally. He didn't mention it. He just put it on the shelf near the window where there was good light. He noticed that the quiet in his house had changed its quality. Not because it was less quiet, the house was the same house the same evenings. But somewhere along the way, it had stopped feeling like a reminder of what was absent and started feeling more like the natural end of a day that had had enough in it. He wasn't sure exactly when that shift had happened. He suspected it had happened gradually, the way most real changes do not in a single moment you could point to, but in the accumulation of unremarkable ones. On a Saturday morning in late November, with the Memphis cold pressing flat against the cafe windows, Maya set her cup down and looked out at the street for a long moment. There was a particular quality to her expression, not quite distant, but inward, like she was taking stock of something. Moises watched her and didn't say anything, giving the moment its space. He had learned this about her over the past months, that she processed things at her own pace and arrived at them in her own time, and that the right response to that was usually just to be present and not fill the silence with something unnecessary. It was one of those things that sounds simple and isn't. After a while, she signed not as a question directed at him, but more like saying something out loud that she'd been turning over privately. "I think I might actually like it here." He looked at her. "Memphis," she considered. "I'm not sure about the city yet, but I like what I've found here." She said it plainly, the way she said most things. No performance, no invitation to make more of it than it was. Just a fact she'd arrived at and was reporting with the particular quietness of someone who doesn't say things until she means them. Moises looked out the window at the street, at the city he'd lived in his whole life, the one he'd stayed in after his wife died, because leaving felt like one loss too many, the one that had held him through the years when he'd needed something solid underneath him. He had never thought of Memphis as something you found. It had always just been where he was. But sitting across from her now, watching the cold November light come through the glass, he thought he understood something of what she meant. He thought about the first Saturday she had walked into this cafe and stood in front of his table holding her coffee, deciding whether to ask for something as simple as a chair. He thought about what it costs to ask that question, not the words of it which are small, but the admission underneath them. "I am alone. I need something. I am willing to say so." Most people, he had come to believe, chose the easier thing, looked at the full room and decided the effort wasn't worth it. Turned around and went somewhere else. She hadn't. And he thought about his own answer, how easily it had come, how naturally his hands had moved, and how he had not known in that moment that he was answering something much larger than a question about a chair, that he was choosing without knowing he was choosing to let something in. Neither of them had planned any of this. There was no moment where they had decided to begin. There was only the small accumulation of Saturdays, one question, one answer, one cup of coffee one evening, in a warm room full of people who had found each other across every kind of distance, until what had been nothing became quietly and without announcement, something. That Moises thought was probably how it always worked. Not the big decisions, not the moments you could see coming and prepare for, just the small ones, the ones where you raised your hands and spoke instead of turning away, where you signed, "Of course, please sit." Instead of looking confused, where you chose for no reason, you could fully explain to leave the door open instead of letting it close. Just the small ones. And the willingness when the moment arrived to answer. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, or share a moment when a small, simple choice ended up meaning more than you expected. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There are more stories like this one coming, the kind that don't make the news, but probably should. Thanks for being here. See you next week.